You know that feeling when something shocking happens, but deep down it almost feels familiar.
Yeah, like you've seen the pieces lining up for a while.
Exactly, like you've seen it building, slowly, maybe almost inevitably. Well, today we're taking a deep dive into that very sensation. We're exploring how what might seem like a sudden political upheaval is actually, maybe, the end result of trends building for decades.
Uh-huh. The culmination.
Our mission today is to unpack excerpts from Naomi Klein's pretty sharp 2017 book, No Is Not Enough.
It's a really compelling read.
Her core argument is fascinating, that figures like Donald Trump aren't some, random rupture, an anomaly, but more like a predictable outcome.
An outcome of these, like, dangerous stories our culture tells itself about wealth, power.
Exactly. Stories that have been around for a very long time. So we'll explore how those underlying ideas paved the way. And, maybe more importantly, we'll look at what alternative visions are starting to emerge to chart a genuinely different future.
The yes part, not just the no.
Right. And this isn't just about understanding one specific political moment. It's about spotting patterns, having those aha moments about how power actually works.
And seeing how history shapes your world right now.
And maybe thinking about what you can do about it. Okay, let's unpack this.
So Klein kicks off with this really striking idea about Trump mastering what she calls super branding.
Okay, super branding. What's that about?
Well, it builds on her earlier work. She argues companies like, say, Nike or Apple, they shifted. They weren't just making stuff anymore.
Right, they make shoes, they make phones.
But beyond that, they started manufacturing a feeling, a sense of tribal belonging, she calls it, through branding. And she suggests Trump basically took that playbook into politics.
So the idea is that people aren't just voting for policies, they're sort of identifying with a brand like they would a favorite team or product.
Pretty much. And this ties into things like his reality TV background, right? Books like The Art of the Deal.
So how did something like The Apprentice shape this brand, maybe differently than, typical campaign ads?
Well, Klein argues it wasn't just entertainment. It presented this really harsh narrative, a sadistic drama, she calls it.
Ooh, okay.
Where the message was basically, you could be the homeless guy or you could be Trump. Just stark winners and losers.
That's pretty blunt.
Yeah. And she thinks it trained an audience to see the world in those terms. Almost a tribal choice. It turned followers into really fierce brand loyalists, maybe more than just voters.
And the book argues this brand focus is why maybe traditional political scandals didn't stick. They just sort of bounced off.
Exactly. Because he was operating by brand rules, not conventional political rules. It also connects to what she calls the omnipresent conflicts of interest.
Right, the lines blurring between the business and the office.
Yeah, like that lawsuit involving Melania Trump.
Yeah.
Klein frames it less as about a specific product, more about directly cashing in on the brand value gained from being First Lady. It points to how the Trumps, as this brand-based entity, seem to view public office itself, like a short-term investment to enormously swell the value of your commercial brand.
That's quite a claim. Are there specific examples?
She mentions Eric Trump's trip to Uruguay. Back in January 2017, he went to meet a developer who was paying to use the Trump name on a new tower.
Okay.
And the cost for his Secret Service protection on that business trip, paid by U.S. taxpayers.
Right. That definitely blurs the line. So, okay, if public office becomes this kind of commercial venture and politics turns into macabre entertainment, like you said.
Yeah, a cesspool where the games begin, as Klein puts it.
What does that do to public conversation beyond just, the spectacle? What's the deeper cost when politics is treated like a show?
Well, that's a really key question, and it leads straight into Klein's other big idea, the shock doctrine.
Okay, the shock doctrine. I've heard that term, also called disaster capitalism.
Right, same concept, basically. It's this pretty chilling idea that crises, real ones, or even just perceived ones, create these windows of opportunity.
Opportunity for what?
To push through really unpopular policies, things that favor private interests, often under the banner of neoliberalism.
Okay, define neoliberalism in this context.
So we're talking deregulation, privatizing public services, cutting social spending, that kind of package. It's like economic shock treatment, Klein argues, that benefits a select few while the public is distracted or disoriented by the crisis.
And she argues this isn't just theory, right? There's a history here.
Oh, absolutely. She points way back to the 1970s. Chile, after the CIA-backed coup.
Yeah.
That was like the first full-scale test case for economist Milton Friedman's neoliberal ideas.
What happened there?
Democracy was suspended, and they privatized almost everything: public schools, healthcare, pensions, even kindergartens and cemeteries.
Wow, cemeteries.
Yeah. And Klein quotes Richard Nixon's directive about Chile back then. Make the economy scream. It highlights how deliberate this approach could be.
Chilling. And it wasn't just happening overseas.
No, Klein brings it home too. New York City's fiscal crisis in the mid-'70s. She argues that was used as a domestic testing ground for the same playbook.
And Trump appears here too.
Yeah, she introduces him as a proto-disaster capitalist. Even back then. He managed to get these incredible terms from the city, which was desperate, like a massive $360 million tax break for the Grand Hyatt Hotel project.
So basically using the city's crisis for private gain, transforming public space.
That's the argument. And if you want a more modern, maybe even more stark example, she points straight at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
Right. How does that fit the disaster capitalism model?
Klein argues the devastation wasn't just natural in its effects. She says decades of what she calls a war on the public sphere, tax cuts, neglecting infrastructure, that sort of thing, had weakened the city's defenses before the storm even hit.
So it created a kind of engineered vulnerability.
Precisely. And then, after the storm hit, you saw the playbook roll out. Thousands of public housing units, many not even badly damaged, were demolished, replaced with expensive condos.
And the relief effort itself.
FEMA awarded contracts to companies that weren't really qualified. Like Lighthouse Disaster Relief, a religious group that got paid over $5 million for a base camp they never finished. Klein also mentions allegations about Mike Pence, who was a congressman then, potentially helping corporations profit from the relief funds.
And then there was the narrative around it too, right? The looting.
Yeah, that's a crucial part. Klein points out how media coverage focused heavily on looting, which helped paint New Orleans' black residents as dangerous.
Justifying more policing, more militarization.
Exactly. A trend that's obviously continued and expanded. So if that's the history, Klein warns us to look out for what she calls a toxic to-do list.
A toxic to-do list? What's that?
It's this idea that administrations might have a wish list of radical policies, things too unpopular to pass in normal times, just waiting for the next crisis to provide cover.
Like what kind of policies?
Think pushes for privatized education, like from Betsy DeVos, or plans to dismantle Social Security, efforts to control the press, weaken unions, curb protests. It also includes the growing role of private prisons or defense contractors like Eric Prince's company, Frontier Services Group, shifting focus to things like border security, using crisis points to expand private control.
It really does seem like a pattern of profiting from chaos based on her analysis. So thinking about all these examples, Chile, NYC, Katrina, how does understanding that history help you, the listener, recognize maybe similar tactics today? When you see crises unfolding, economic shocks, disasters, security threats?
It gives you a lens, right, to ask some questions.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Klein connects this shock doctrine stuff to other major crises, doesn't she? Like climate change.
Yes, definitely. She sees these things as deeply intertwined. She talks about the silent, watery death of the Great Barrier Reef, for instance. Just 1 degree Celsius of warming caused this massive die-off.
A really stark example of what's at stake.
And a reminder of the potential for irreversible catastrophe, as she puts it, if emissions aren't cut drastically.
How does she link this to the economic ideas we were just discussing, the neoliberalism?
She argues the fossil fuel industry's resistance isn't just about protecting their profits in the short term. It's about defending the whole ideological project neoliberalism.
How so?
Because their whole worldview is based on the market is always right, regulation is always wrong. Climate action fundamentally challenges that.
So tackling climate change isn't just about emissions, it's about challenging that whole economic philosophy.
That's her point. And kind of ironically, she notes that low oil prices actually act as a brake on new drilling projects, sometimes forcing companies like ExxonMobil to write down reserves, which sort of goes against their own ideology.
Interesting. And then there's economic inequality, another huge crisis Klein connects.
Huge is right.
Yeah.
The stats she quotes are just staggering. Globally, something like $256 trillion in total wealth.
Okay, it's a lot.
But the bottom half of the world's population owns less than 1% of it, while the richest 10% own almost 90%.
Wow, less than 1% for half the people.
It basically shreds that old argument that, giving more to the wealthy helps the poor trickle down. The numbers just don't support it anymore, she argues.
So how do these neoliberal policies, privatization, deregulation, low taxes, fit in here?
Well, Klein says they tend to shift the blame. Instead of addressing the structural reasons for inequality or suffering, they make it about individual failure. You didn't work hard enough, or you made bad choices.
Which creates an opening, perhaps.
Exactly. Fertile ground for what she calls a divide and conquer strategy. She argues Trump really tapped into the economic anxiety, but also mixing it with racial and gender resentments.
Targeting specific groups.
Particularly, she suggests, white Americans who felt they were losing economic ground and that sense of, quote, superior status.
And this isn't new, this tactic.
No, she points to a long history of using race as a wedge to break up potential multiracial alliances that could challenge power. Think Jim Crow laws, the war on drugs.
So the goal in her analysis is about restoring a perceived hierarchy, like putting white men safely back on top.
That's how she frames it.
Yeah.
And she connects this rhetoric directly to the rise in hate groups and hate incidents reported after the 2016 election.
This leads back to the idea of politics as entertainment, maybe. The distraction.
Yeah, it's a critical point. How politicians might use these highly entertaining but ultimately superficial fights. Think Trump's nicknames, Little Marco, Lion Ted.
Right, they grab headlines.
They do. But Klein asks, what are they distracting from? They avoid real policy debate, real accountability. So what are the actual stakes when the political stage becomes more about reality TV-style feuds than substantive issues?
It's crucial to see how these things connect the climate crisis, the economic inequality, the identity politics. Klein argues they're not separate issues. So maybe think about how this kind of intergenerational theft, this systemic inequality she describes, might be playing out in your own life in ways maybe you haven't fully considered.
Yeah, how does it touch your day-to-day?
Okay, so Klein lays out this pretty heavy analysis of the problems. The shock doctrine, branding, intersecting crises. But the book title is No is Not Enough. So what's the alternative? How do we resist and reimagine?
Right, that's the core message. Just opposing the bad stuff, the bad ideas and bad actors, isn't sufficient. You need a positive vision, a strong yes.
A yes agenda. Does she give examples of how this works, this resistance?
Absolutely. History is full of what she calls shock resistance, times when people pushed back against the shock doctrine playbook.
Like where?
Argentina, 2001. Huge economic crisis. Government declares a state of siege, basically martial law.
Okay, sounds like a classic shock situation.
It was. But people remembered the brutal military coup from 1976. They knew what could happen. So tens of thousands defied the orders. They came out banging pots and pans.
That's a cacerolazo.
Exactly. Shouting, que se vayan todos, everyone out. And Klein argues that collective memory, that act of defiance, prevented years of potentially devastating economic bloodletting.
Wow, so memory is a form of resistance. Any other examples?
Spain, 2004. After the Madrid train bombings, the government immediately tried to blame the Basque separatist group ETA, likely to justify its involvement in the Iraq War.
But that wasn't true, was it?
Evidence quickly pointed elsewhere, towards al-Qaeda-related militants. But instead of just accepting the government's initial story, citizens demanded the truth, demanded accountability. And just days later, they voted the ruling party out of power. They refused the shock narrative.
Powerful stuff. Collective memory thwarting the official story. What about more recent examples? Things happening now or around the time the book was written?
Yeah, she points to several. The hashtag #GrabYourWallet boycotts, for instance, which successfully pressured retailers to drop Trump-branded products.
Right, using consumer power.
And the Day Without Immigrants, back in February 2017, that was a powerful demonstration of economic leverage, showing, as organizers put it, this city would stop functioning if we weren't there. The March for Science on Earth Day 2017. Tens of thousands marched globally, not just protesting attacks on science, but as Klein quotes one organizer, it was a trumpet call for scientists themselves to get politically engaged.
Taking a stand.
And she highlights acts of interfaith solidarity, like Muslim groups raising money to repair vandalized Jewish cemeteries. And of course, the water protectors at Standing Rock.
Standing Rock, yeah. That felt significant.
Very. Klein emphasizes the shift in language from protesters to protectors. And the deeper question being asked there, highlighted by indigenous leadership. How do we live with the earth again, not against it?
A fundamental shift in perspective. But Klein also looks back at recent history, right? At missed opportunities.
She does. She points specifically to the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis during the Obama administration.
What about it?
She argues there's this rare political opening then, a moment where real transformative change was possible, because the old system had so clearly failed.
But it didn't happen, not in the way it could have.
Klein suggests that progressives, maybe confused access with power, They had a seat at the table but didn't push hard enough for deep systemic reforms. So we got, in her words, Band-Aids on gaping wounds rather than fundamental change.
And other places did things differently.
She contrasts it with Germany, for example, which used that period to invest heavily in a green economy, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs and boosting renewable energy significantly. It showed what was possible.
So if that was a mischance, what does this bold yes agenda actually look like now? What are the components?
It's about pushing the boundaries of what seems politically possible. Klein credits figures like Bernie Sanders, for example, with doing that, championing much bolder policies to tackle inequality, even if, she notes, he didn't fully center racial justice in the same way initially.
So individual politicians can push the envelope. What about broader movements?
She highlights things like the LEAP Manifesto in Canada. That was co-created by a whole coalition of different movements, indigenous groups, environmentalists, labor unions.
What did it call for?
Really systemic stuff like energy democracy. Think citizen-owned renewable energy like they have in parts of Germany. Energy reparations for communities hit hardest by extraction. A guaranteed basic income. Recognizing unpaid care work. It's designed as a living, evolving project.
That sounds ambitious, comprehensive.
Very. And she points to the Movement for Black Lives platform in the U.S. as another example. A really thorough document with nearly 40 specific policy demands things like free college, breaking up big banks. It's another powerful yes vision.
Okay, but the big question always is, how do you pay for all this, these massive transformations?
Klein tackles that head on. She argues the money is there. It's just a matter of political will and priorities.
Where would it come from?
She lists several potential sources. Ending subsidies for fossil fuels, putting a tax on financial transactions, increasing royalties on resource extraction, higher taxes on the very wealthy and corporations, a progressive carbon tax, cuts to military spending.
So the argument is that scarcity is manufactured.
Exactly. Her line is powerful. Public scarcity in times of unprecedented private wealth is a manufactured crisis. The resources exist, they're just not being directed towards public good.
Ultimately, then, it sounds like it comes down to imagination.
That's a huge part of it. Reclaiming our utopian imagination, as she puts it. Daring to envision a radically better future, not just trying to tweak the current system or go back to the world that gave us Trump.
That feels challenging, maybe, when things seem difficult.
It is. But she draws inspiration from history here, too, pointing out that even people who knew nothing but enslavement were somehow endlessly creative in finding ways to nurture and keep alive the dream of freedom. That capacity for imagination is powerful.
So bringing it back to you, the listener, if we accept Klein's premise that we need a yes, how can you contribute to building that vision, not just reacting with no? What parts of that toxic to-do list she mentioned or the yes agenda we just discussed resonate most with you? And how might thinking about that shape your own actions or perspective?
Yeah, where do you plug in?
So let's try to wrap this up. What's the big takeaway from this deep dive into Naomi Klein's no is not enough?
Well, I think it's that understanding figures like Trump or the political moments they represent isn't really about seeing them as isolated incidents.
Right. It's more about recognizing them as a kind of logical, maybe deeply unsettling, but logical conclusion of these much longer-term trends in society and the economy.
Exactly. We've talked about the shock doctrine, how crises get exploited to push through unpopular agendas. We looked at how corporate branding tactics have reshaped politics, made it more tribal, perhaps.
And how all these intersecting issues, climate, massive inequality, the politics of division and resentment, how they all kind of feed into each other.
But importantly, it's not presented as just doom and gloom. Right?
No, definitely not. The deep dive also really highlighted the power of that collective memory we talked about, the shock resistance.
And these emerging yes movements happening all over the world, pushing for genuinely bold, transformative change. Visions grounded in interconnection and a real commitment to building something better.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. If Klein is right, and the struggles we see today are deeply rooted in these historical patterns of wealth, power, and exploitation,
then how might understanding your own history, your personal history, your community's history, the history of collective action, how might that understanding empower your path forward? How can knowing where we've been help shape where we're going?